The sun was setting over Dallas as Chuck Norris finished another charity event at the Children's Hospital. He had just spent 3 hours with sick kids, signing autographs and showing them some basic karate moves. These visits always filled his heart with joy, but today, something felt different. As he walked to his truck in the parking lot, Chuck felt a strange pull to take a different route home. Instead of getting on the highway like he usually did, Chuck decided to drive through the older part of downtown Dallas. The streets here told stories of better times. Old buildings stood like silent guardians watching over a neighborhood that had seen its share of struggles. Chuck rolled down his windows, letting the evening air flow through his truck as he drove slowly past empty lots and small businesses trying to survive. Chuck had always been drawn to these forgotten parts of the city. Maybe it was because he remembered his own humble beginnings, or maybe it was just his nature to notice people who others might overlook. Tonight, that instinct would change everything. As he turned down a narrow street lined with small restaurants and shops, Chuck noticed movement in the alley behind a burger joint. At first, he thought it might be a stray dog or cat looking for food, but as he got closer, he realized it was a person. An older man was bent over a large dumpster, carefully searching through the contents. Chuck's first thought was to keep driving. The man probably wouldn't want to be seen, and Chuck didn't want to embarrass him. But something made him slow down and take a closer look. There was something familiar about the way the man moved. Even while digging through trash, there was a certain grace to his movements, a balance that spoke of years of training. Chuck pulled his truck to the side of the road and sat there for a moment, watching. The man's hair was gray and messy, his clothes were torn and dirty, but the way he carried himself was unmistakable. Those shoulders, that stance, the way he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Chuck had seen it 1,000 times before. His heart started racing as memories flooded back. Tournament halls filled with screaming crowds, the sound of bare feet on canvas mats, the smell of sweat and determination. And always, always there was this man standing across from him, ready to fight with everything he had. Chuck got out of his truck slowly, his legs feeling weak. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. This had to be someone else, someone who just happened to move the same way. But as he got closer, there was no denying it. "Tony?" Chuck called out softly. The man froze. For a long moment, he didn't turn around. Chuck could see his shoulders tense up, and he knew the man had heard him. Finally, slowly, "Tony." Lightning. Rodriguez turned to face his old rival. The years had not been kind to Tony. His face was thin and weathered, with lines that spoke of hard times and sleepless nights. His eyes, once bright with the fire of competition, now looked tired and ashamed. But it was definitely him. Chuck would know that face anywhere. "Chuck Norris," Tony said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was hoping nobody would ever see me like this." Chuck felt his heart break. This was the man who had pushed him to become the fighter he was today. Tony "Lightning" Rodriguez had been the fastest kicker Chuck had ever faced. In their prime, people would pack arenas just to watch them fight. Tony had been Chuck's greatest rival, but also his greatest teacher. They had fought each other 3 times in official matches. Chuck won the first fight after a brutal 5 rounds that left both men exhausted. Tony won the second match with a lightning-fast kick that nobody saw coming, including Chuck. The third fight was so close that Chuck only won by a single point, and both men knew it could have gone either way. But it wasn't just about winning and losing. Every time they fought, they brought out the best in each other. Tony's speed forced Chuck to become more defensive. Chuck's power forced Tony to become more creative. They were like 2 artists painting a masterpiece together, even though they were trying to defeat each other. "Tony, what happened to you?" Chuck asked, stepping closer but keeping his distance out of respect. Tony looked down at his dirty hands, then back at the dumpster. "Life happened, Chuck. Life happened, and I wasn't ready for it." Chuck remembered the last time he had seen Tony. It was at a martial arts convention about 15 years ago. Tony had been successful then, running a chain of dojos and talking about expanding his business. He had a beautiful wife and 2 kids, and everything seemed to be going perfectly for him. "I heard about your schools," Chuck said carefully. "You Had 6 locations, right? I always meant to visit one of them. Tony's laugh was bitter and dry. Yeah, 6 locations. 6 beautiful dojos with everything a student could want. Top quality equipment, great instructors, hundreds of students. I thought I had it all figured out. A police car drove by slowly, and both men instinctively stepped deeper into the shadows of the alley. Chuck noticed how Tony's body tensed up, ready to run if needed. It broke Chuck's heart to see a man who had once commanded respect now afraid of being seen. "Want to get some coffee?" Chuck asked. "There's a place down the street that stays open late." Tony shook his head quickly. "Chuck, I appreciate it, but look at me. I can't go into a restaurant looking like this. People will stare, and you'll be embarrassed to be seen with me." Chuck looked at Tony for a long moment. "Brother, I've been in fights where I ended up covered in blood and sweat. I've been thrown through windows in movies and rolled around in mud. You think I care what people think about how someone looks?" Tony's eyes filled with tears, but he tried to hide it by turning away. "It's not just how I look, Chuck. It's who I've become. I'm not the same man you used to fight. That guy is gone." "No, he's not," Chuck said firmly. "I can see him right there. The way you move, the way you stand, even the way you're protecting yourself right now. That's still Tony Lightning Rodriguez. You're still the fighter who taught me that speed can beat power if you're smart enough." Chuck remembered their first fight like it was yesterday. He had walked into that tournament thinking he would easily beat this skinny guy with the weird nickname. But Tony had moved like water, flowing around Chuck's attacks and striking back so fast that Chuck barely saw the kicks coming. Chuck had won that fight, but just barely, and he had walked away with a new respect for what real speed could do. "You remember that kick you threw in our second fight?" Chuck asked, smiling slightly. "The one that knocked me down?" Despite everything, Tony's eyes brightened just a little. "The spinning heel kick. You dropped your left hand for just a split second and I saw the opening." "Fastest kick I ever took," Chuck admitted. "I was unconscious before I hit the ground. When I woke up, you were standing over me making sure I was okay. That's when I knew you weren't just a great fighter. You were a good man." Tony wiped his eyes with the back of his dirty sleeve. "That was a long time ago, Chuck. A lot has changed since then." Chuck looked around the alley, taking in the broken bottles and trash scattered on the ground. He thought about his own life, the movies, the TV shows, the comfortable ranch where he lived. He thought about all the opportunities that had come his way, and how different things might have been if their positions were reversed. "How long have you been living like this?" Chuck asked gently. 8 months, Tony answered after a long pause. 8 months sleeping in doorways, under bridges, anywhere the police won't bother me. I keep telling myself it's temporary, that I'll figure something out, but each day gets harder." Chuck felt anger rising in his chest, but not at Tony. He was angry at life, at circumstances, at whatever forces had brought a good man to this point. "Have you eaten today?" Tony shrugged. "I found half a sandwich earlier. It wasn't too old." That was it. Chuck couldn't stand there any longer just talking. "Come on, we're getting you some real food." "Chuck, I told you, I can't go into a restaurant like this. Then we'll get takeout and eat in my truck. Tony, you're coming with me and I'm not taking no for an answer. We have a lot to talk about." As they walked toward Chuck's truck, Chuck's mind was already racing with plans. This wasn't just about buying an old friend a meal. This was about something much bigger. Tony Rodriguez had been one of the greatest martial artists of their generation, and he deserved better than sleeping in alleys and eating from dumpsters. But Chuck also knew that Tony's pride would make this difficult. You don't just offer charity to a man who used to be a champion. Whatever Chuck was going to do, he would have to be smart about it. He would have to find a way to help Tony that didn't feel like pity. As they reached the truck, Tony stopped and looked back at the alley where Chuck had found him. "You know what the hardest part is?" he said quietly. "What's that?" "I keep thinking about all the students I used to teach, kids who looked up to me, who believed in me. What would they think if they saw me now?" Chuck put his hand on Tony's shoulder. "They'd think their teacher was human, and if they're half as good as you taught them to be, they'd want to help you get back on your feet." Tony looked at Chuck with something that might have been hope flickering in his tired eyes. "You really think so?" "I know so. Chuck said, opening the passenger door of his truck. "Now get in. We've got a lot of catching up to do, and I'm buying you the biggest steak dinner they have." As they drove away from the alley, Chuck couldn't help but think that this chance meeting wasn't really chance at all. Maybe this was exactly where he was supposed to be tonight. Maybe finding Tony was the reason he had felt that strange pull to drive through this part of town. Whatever happened next, Chuck knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let his old rival face this fight alone. The smell of fresh coffee and grilled burgers filled the air as Chuck and Tony sat in a corner booth at Danny's all-night diner. Chuck had chosen this place on purpose. It was the kind of spot where nobody would bother them, where working people came to eat real food without any fuss. The waitress had looked at Tony's appearance for just a second before Chuck gave her a smile that said everything was okay. Tony held the hot coffee cup with both hands, as if he was trying to absorb every bit of warmth from it. Chuck watched his old rival carefully, noticing how thin his wrists had become, how his clothes hung loose on what used to be a powerful frame. But he also noticed that Tony still sat with perfect posture, still moved with that controlled grace that had made him so dangerous in the ring. "Tell me what happened, Tony," Chuck said gently, pushing a plate of food toward his friend. "The last time I saw you, you were on top of the world." Tony stared down at the burger and fries, and Chuck could see him fighting with his pride. Finally, hunger won, and Tony took a careful bite. His eyes closed for a moment, and Chuck realized it might have been days since Tony had eaten a real meal. "You remember the martial arts expo in Las Vegas about 15 years ago?" Tony asked between bites. Chuck nodded. "You had just opened your 4th school. You were talking about franchising, maybe going national with your teaching method. 6 schools total by the end," Tony said, his voice getting stronger as the food hit his system. "Rodriguez Lightning Martial Arts. I had everything figured out, Chuck. State-of-the-art equipment, the best instructors I could find, hundreds of students across all locations. We were teaching traditional karate, but also self-defense classes. For women, anti-bullying programs for kids, fitness classes for seniors. It wasn't just about fighting. We were helping people." Chuck could hear the pride in Tony's voice, even after all these years. "That sounds amazing. I always knew you'd be a great teacher. My business partner, David Chen, he was the money guy. I was the face of the schools, the head instructor. But David handled all the business stuff, the books, the contracts, the expansion plans. He was smart, really smart. Had an MBA from some fancy school back east. I trusted him completely." Tony paused to take another bite, and Chuck could see the pain building in his friend's eyes. For 8 years, everything was perfect. My wife Linda was helping run the front desk at the main school. My kids, Miguel and Sophia, they were training with me every day after school. Miguel was getting really good. He had my speed, but better technique. Sophia was only 12, but she was already winning tournaments in her age group. Chuck smiled, imagining Tony teaching his own children the same techniques that had once made Chuck work so hard to defeat him. "The schools were making good money," Tony continued. "Not crazy money, but enough for us to live well. Linda and I bought a nice house in the suburbs. Nothing fancy, but it had a big backyard where the kids could practice. I thought I was building something that would last, something I could pass down to Miguel and Sophia someday." "What went wrong?" Chuck asked, though he was already dreading the answer. Tony's hands tightened around his coffee cup. "David had been stealing from the business for 3 years before I found out. Not just a little bit here and there, he was taking everything. He set up fake companies that the schools were supposedly paying for equipment and services. He was writing himself bonus checks and covering it up in the books. He even took out loans against the schools without telling me, using my signature that he somehow got from old contracts." Chuck felt his jaw clench. He had seen this kind of betrayal before. People who took advantage of others' trust to steal their life's work. "How did you find out?" "One of my instructors noticed that we hadn't gotten new equipment in over a year, even though David kept saying we had ordered stuff and it was coming soon. She started asking questions, and when I looked into it, nothing made sense. That's when I discovered David had been moving money around, paying bills late, keeping the schools barely afloat while he built himself a nice life on our profits." Tony stared out the window at the empty street. When I confronted him, he didn't even deny it, just said it was the cost of doing business, that he deserved more money for all his hard work. Then he disappeared, took all the remaining money from the accounts, and left town. I never saw him again. Did you call the police? Of course I did, but David was smart about it. He had covered his tracks pretty well, made it look like everything was legal on paper. The detective said they could investigate, but it would take years and cost more money than I had. And even if they caught him, most of the money was already gone. Chuck shook his head in disgust. So you lost everything? Worse than that, because David had taken out those loans in my name. I was personally responsible for paying them back. The banks didn't care that I hadn't known about them. My signature was on the papers. I had to sell all 6 schools just to pay the debts, and it still wasn't enough. I declared bankruptcy, but that didn't stop the lawsuits. Tony finished his burger and pushed the plate away. Linda tried to stand by me at first, she really did. But the stress was killing our marriage. I was angry all the time, staying up all night trying to figure out how to save what was left. I stopped teaching, stopped training, basically stopped being the man she married. The kids were confused and scared because suddenly we couldn't afford things we used to take for granted. Chuck could see the pain in his friend's eyes as he relived those difficult days. The worst part was losing my students. These were people who had trusted me with their training, some of them for years. When the schools closed, they lost their place to practice, their community, their sense of belonging. I felt like I had failed everyone who believed in me. That wasn't your fault, Tony. You were betrayed by someone you trusted. Maybe. But it sure felt like my fault. I was supposed to be the leader, the guy who had everything under control. Instead, I had let a thief destroy everything we had built together. Tony was quiet for a moment, then continued. Linda filed for divorce about a year after everything fell apart. She said she couldn't watch me destroy myself anymore. She took the kids and moved across the country to live near her sister. I get a phone call from Miguel and Sophia maybe twice a year, but it's awkward. They have a new life now, and I'm just a reminder of bad times. Chuck felt his heart breaking for his old friend. Have you tried to contact other people from the martial arts community? I know a lot of guys who would help you get back on your feet. Tony shook his head firmly. That's the thing, Chuck. I couldn't handle having people see me as a failure. You know how our world works. Reputation is everything. I was supposed to be Tony Lightning Rodriguez, the guy who fought Chuck Norris and held his own. How could I call up people and tell them I was broke and homeless? Because they're your friends, Chuck said simply. Pride, Chuck. Stupid, stubborn. Pride. I kept thinking I would figure something out on my own. I got a job at a warehouse, but my back started giving me problems from all those years of training and fighting. Then I hurt my shoulder lifting boxes, and they had to let me go because I couldn't do the work anymore. Tony looked down at his hands. That's when I started drinking. Not a lot at first, just enough to help me sleep, to stop thinking about everything I had lost. But it got worse. I'd have a few beers in the morning just to feel normal, then more during the day to deal with the pain in my back and shoulder. Chuck had seen this story before, how one bad break could lead to another, until everything spiraled out of control. The drinking made it impossible to keep any job for very long. I'd show up late or not show up at all. My landlord evicted me when I couldn't make rent 3 months in a row. I stayed in cheap motels for a while, then in my car until it got repossessed. After that, Tony gestured around the diner. After that, it was the streets. How long since you've talked to your kids? 6 months. Sophia called on my birthday, but I was having a bad day and I probably didn't sound good. Think it scared her. Miguel sent me a text a few weeks later saying maybe I should get some help before calling them again. Chuck sat back in the booth, trying to process everything Tony had told him. This was a man who had once been at the top of his game, respected and successful, with a loving family and a thriving business. Now he was living in alleys, eating from dumpsters, too proud to ask for help and too broken to help himself. Tony, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me. Okay. Do you still have any fight left in you? Because what I'm seeing isn't the man who used to push me to my limits. That Tony Rodriguez never gave up even when he was losing. He always kept fighting until the final bell. Tony looked up at Chuck, and for just a moment Chuck saw a flash of the old fire in his friend's eyes. I don't know, Chuck. I honestly don't know if that guy still exists. Chuck leaned forward. Well, I think it's time we found out. Chuck couldn't sleep that night. He lay in his comfortable bed staring at the ceiling of his ranch house, but all he could see was Tony's face in that alley. Every time he closed his eyes, memories came flooding back, not just of their fights, but of the man Tony used to be. The confident teacher who could make a difficult technique look effortless. The devoted father who brought his kids to tournaments and cheered louder than anyone when they won. The loyal friend who always checked on Chuck after their matches, to make sure he was okay. At 3 a.m, Chuck gave up trying to sleep and walked out to his kitchen. He made coffee and sat at his table, looking out at the stars over his property. This place had been his dream for years. 200 acres of Texas land where he could train, think, and enjoy the peace he had earned through decades of hard work. But tonight, that peace felt empty. Tony was probably sleeping under a bridge somewhere, cold and hungry, while Chuck sat in luxury. The unfairness of it made Chuck's stomach turn. Both men had started from nothing. Both had worked their way up, through talent and determination. The only difference was luck. Chuck had gotten the right opportunities at the right time, while Tony had trusted the wrong person at the worst possible moment. Chuck pulled out his phone and started making notes. He had an idea forming, something that might help Tony without destroying what little pride his friend had left. But it would have to be done carefully, and it would definitely shock a lot of people. By 6 a.m, Chuck had a plan. It was bold, maybe even crazy, but it felt right. He started making phone calls. The first call went to Robert Kim, president of the International Karate Federation. Robert had been a tournament promoter back when Chuck and Tony were competing, and he now ran one of the biggest martial arts organizations in the world. Chuck Norris calling at 6 a.m, Robert said with a laugh when he picked up. This must be important. Robert, I need to ask you something, and I need you to hear me out before you say no. Chuck explained what he had in mind. There was a long silence on the other end of the phone. Chuck, are you serious about this? Robert finally asked. Dead. Serious. Can you make it happen? I can make anything happen if there's enough interest. But Chuck, people are going to ask questions. They're going to want to know why. Let them ask. Can you set up a press conference for this afternoon? This afternoon, Chuck, that's not enough time to... Robert, trust me on this. The story's going to get out anyway. Better to control how it gets told. After Robert agreed, Chuck made his second call to Dr. Patricia Valdez, a sports medicine specialist who had worked with fighters for over 20 years. If Tony was going to make any kind of comeback, he would need medical clearance and probably months of rehabilitation. Patricia, I need you to examine someone for me. Today, if possible. Chuck, I'm booked solid for the next 2 weeks. This is important. It's about Tony Rodriguez. Patricia was quiet for a moment. She remembered Tony from the old days. Is he okay? That's what I need you to find out. Chuck's third call was to his agent, who nearly choked on his morning coffee. When Chuck explained what he wanted to announce. Chuck, have you lost your mind? You're 78 years old. You haven't fought competitively in decades, and you want to announce a comeback fight with a homeless man? It's not a comeback fight, it's an exhibition. And Tony Rodriguez isn't just any homeless man, he's one of the greatest fighters of our generation. Chuck, the insurance alone is going to be a nightmare. And what if he gets hurt? What if you get hurt? This is crazy. Sometimes crazy is exactly what the world needs. By 10 a.m, Chuck was back at the diner where he had left Tony the night before. He found his friend sitting in the same booth, nursing a cup of coffee and staring out the window. Tony looked like he hadn't slept either. Morning, Tony. Tony looked up surprised. Chuck, what are you doing here? I told you last night we needed to find out if you still had any fight left in you. Well, I think I found a way to do that. Chuck slid into the booth across from Tony and pulled out his phone. I'm about to make an announcement that's going to change everything. But before I do, I need to know if you're willing to trust me. What kind of announcement? Chuck took a deep breath. I'm calling a press conference for this afternoon. I'm going to announce that Chuck Norris and Tony Lightning Rodriguez are going to have an exhibition match. All proceeds will go to a fund for former martial artists who are struggling financially. Tony's coffee cup hit the table so hard that coffee splashed everywhere. Chuck, are you insane? Look at me. I can barely walk 3 blocks without getting winded. I haven't trained in years. I'm living on the streets. You want to put me in front of cameras and announce that I'm going to fight Chuck Norris? Yes, that's exactly what I want to do. Why? So the whole world can watch you beat up a homeless man? So everyone can see how far the great Tony Rodriguez has fallen? Chuck leaned forward, his voice getting more intense. No, Tony. So the whole world can see Tony Rodriguez get back up? Chuck, you don't understand. I'm not the same man I used to be. That fighter you knew is gone. I don't believe that. You know why? Because last night, when I was walking toward you in that alley, you saw me coming before I said a word. Your body turned toward the threat. Your weight shifted to the balls of your feet. Your hands came up just slightly. You didn't even realize you were doing it. But your fighting instincts are still there. Tony shook his head. Fighting instincts don't matter if your body can't back them up. Then we'll get your body ready. I've already called Dr. Valdez. She's going to examine you this afternoon, figure out what we're working with. Then we'll get you the best trainers, the best nutritionists, whatever you need. Chuck, this is charity. You're trying to help me, and I appreciate it, but I won't be your charity case. Chuck's voice got harder. This isn't charity, Tony. This is business. You think I'm doing this just to be nice? Tony looked confused. What do you mean? I mean, I've been retired for 15 years, and frankly, people are starting to forget about Chuck Norris. My last movie was okay, but it wasn't great. My TV appearances are getting fewer and farther between. But a fight between Chuck Norris and Tony Lightning Rodriguez? That's a story. That's something people will pay to see. Chuck could see Tony, thinking, trying to figure out if Chuck was telling the truth or just trying to make him feel better. Plus, Chuck continued, I owe you something, and it's time I paid it back. You don't owe me anything. Yes, I do. Every time we fought, you made me better. You pushed me to train harder, think faster, fight smarter. Without you, I would never have become the fighter I was. I would never have gotten the movie roles, the endorsement deals, any of it. My success is built on the foundation of fighting men like you. Chuck reached across the table and grabbed Tony's wrist. You remember what you told me after our second fight? When you knocked me out with that spinning heel kick? Tony smiled, slightly. I told you that losing was just another way of learning. That's right, you said every defeat teaches you something that victory can't. Well, I think it's time for both of us to learn something new. Tony was quiet for a long time, staring down at his hands. Chuck could see the war going on inside his friend's head, the desire to fight again, battling against the fear of public failure. How long would we have to train? Tony finally asked. 6 months, maybe 8, depending on what Dr. Valdez says. And you really think people would want to watch 2 old men try to relive their glory days? Chuck laughed. Tony, people love comeback stories. They love seeing someone who's been knocked down get back up and fight again. And they especially love seeing legends face each other one more time. What if I can't do it? What if I train for 6 months and I'm still too slow, too weak? Then we'll find that out together. But I'd rather fail trying than succeed at playing it safe. Tony looked out the window again, watching the morning traffic build up on the street. My kids would probably see it on the news. Probably. What do you think they'd rather see? Their father fighting to get his life back, or their father giving up? They might be embarrassed, or they might be proud. Tony was quiet for another long moment. Then he looked Chuck straight in the eyes. If we do this, I want to train the right way. No shortcuts, no easy path. If I'm going to step into that ring with Chuck Norris, I want to be the best version of myself I can be. Chuck smiled and stuck out his hand. Deal. Tony shook it firmly, and Chuck felt the strength that was still there, buried under months of neglect but not gone. One more thing, Chuck said. You're not staying on the streets anymore. I've got a guest house on my ranch that's sitting empty. You'll stay there during training. Chuck, it's not charity. It's logistics. I need my training partner close by. For the first time since Chuck had found him in that alley, Tony Rodriguez smiled like he meant it. Okay, Chuck, let's shock the world. 6 months later, Tony Rodriguez stood in front of the bathroom mirror in Chuck's guest house, barely recognizing the man staring back at him. The gaunt, hollow-eyed person from the alley was gone. In his place stood a fighter again, not the young champion he had once been, but something even more powerful. His muscles had returned, his eyes were clear and focused, and most importantly, his spirit was alive again. The transformation hadn't been easy. The first month was the hardest thing Tony had ever done in his life. Dr. Valdez had found problems everywhere. His liver was damaged from drinking, his shoulder needed surgery, his back was a mess from sleeping on concrete, and his nutrition was so poor that his body was basically eating itself to survive. But Chuck had refused to let him quit. When Tony wanted to give up after his first week of training left him barely able to walk, Chuck reminded him of their second fight. You knocked me out that day because you never stopped believing you could win, even when I was bigger and stronger. That belief is still in there somewhere. The physical training was only part of it. Chuck had also arranged for Tony to talk to a counselor about the drinking, the depression, and the shame that had been eating him alive for years. At first, Tony hated those sessions. Talking about feelings wasn't something fighters were supposed to do. But slowly he began to understand that healing his mind was just as important as healing his body. The media attention had been intense from the very beginning. When Chuck announced the exhibition match at that first press conference, the story exploded across social media and news channels. Some people called it a publicity stunt. Others said Chuck was crazy for fighting at his age. But most people were fascinated by the idea of seeing these two legends face each other one more time. The story got even bigger when reporters started digging into Tony's background and discovered what had happened to him. Suddenly, it wasn't just about a fight between two old rivals. It was about redemption, second chances, and what happens when someone refuses to give up on a friend. Tony remembered the day his son Miguel called him for the first time in over a year. Tony was in the middle of a training session working on his footwork with Chuck when his phone rang. Dad? Miguel's voice sounded older, more mature than Tony remembered. Miguel, how did you get this number? I saw you on the news. Dad, is it true? Are you really going to fight Chuck Norris? Tony had stepped outside to take the call, his heart pounding harder than it had during training. Yeah, it's true. Are you okay with that? There was a long pause. Dad, I've been worried about you for so long. When Mom said you were homeless, I wanted to come find you. But she said you needed to figure things out on your own. Seeing you on TV, looking healthy and strong again, Dad, I'm proud of you. That phone call had given Tony more motivation than any training session could. His daughter Sophia had called 2 days later, crying and telling him how much she missed him. For the first time in years, Tony felt like he might actually be worthy of being their father again. The training itself became legendary in the martial arts community. Chuck documented parts of it on social media, showing Tony's progress without making him look weak or desperate. Videos of Tony hitting the heavy bag, working on his speed drills, and sparring with Chuck went viral. People couldn't believe how quickly the old Tony Rodriguez was coming back to life. But the real shock came 3 weeks before the fight, when Chuck made another announcement that nobody saw coming. This exhibition match is just the beginning, Chuck told reporters at a packed press conference. Tony and I are starting something called the Fighter's Second Chance program. We're opening a training facility where former martial artists who are struggling can come to get back on their feet. The room exploded with questions, but Chuck kept talking. Too many good people in our community have fallen through the cracks. They gave their lives to martial arts, and when they needed help, there was nowhere to turn. That changes now. Tony was standing beside Chuck at the podium, wearing a clean suit and looking like the respected instructor he used to be. This program isn't just about fighting, Tony added. It's about rebuilding lives. We'll provide job training, counseling, medical care, and yes, a place to train and remember who they used to be. The announcement sent shockwaves through the martial arts world. Within hours, phone calls started pouring in from former fighters who needed help. Famous martial artists pledged money to support the program. Gyms across the country offered to become training partners. What had started as one man helping an old friend had become a movement. The night of the exhibition finally arrived. The arena was packed with over 15,000 people, and millions more were watching on pay-per-view. Tony stood in his corner wearing the same style of fighting shorts he had worn decades earlier, but with "Second Chance" embroidered on the side. Chuck approached him during the final minutes before the fight. "You ready for this, old friend?" Tony nodded, his eyes focused and calm. "I've been ready for this my whole life, Chuck. Not just the fight, the chance to show people that falling down doesn't mean staying down." The crowd erupted when both men walked to the center of the ring. These weren't young, hungry fighters looking to destroy each other. These were two masters, two artists, coming together to show what decades of dedication could create. The exhibition itself was beautiful to watch. Chuck and Tony moved like they were dancing, demonstrating techniques that younger fighters could only dream of mastering. Tony's speed was still there, maybe not quite as lightning fast as it had been in his prime, but smooth and precise. Chuck's power was controlled, his movements economical and perfect. But the most amazing moment came in the third round. Tony threw the same spinning heel kick that had knocked Chuck out in their second professional fight 30 years earlier. This time, Chuck was ready for it. He slipped the kick by inches, then immediately stopped and bowed to Tony in respect for the perfect technique. The crowd went crazy. Both men were smiling as they continued the exhibition, showing combination after combination, each one bringing back memories of their legendary rivalry. When the final bell rang, they embraced in the center of the ring and there wasn't a dry eye in the arena. But the real shock came during the post-fight interview. Tony grabbed the microphone and did something nobody expected. "6 months ago, I was homeless and hopeless," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the arena. "I thought my life was over, that I had nothing left to offer the world. But Chuck Norris didn't just save my life. He reminded me that the strongest technique in martial arts isn't a punch or a kick. It's lifting someone up when they're down." Tony turned to face Chuck. "But this isn't just about me. Right now there are former fighters, former students, former teachers who are struggling just like I was. The Fighters Second Chance program is going to help them, but we need everyone's support." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Donations started flooding in during the live broadcast. By the end of the night, over $2 million had been raised. Martial arts schools from around the world pledged to support the program. Former champions came forward with their own stories of struggle and offered to help. Within a year, the Fighters Second Chance program had opened facilities in 12 cities. Tony became the national director, traveling from location to location to help set up programs and train instructors. He was no longer just Tony Rodriguez, the guy who used to fight Chuck Norris. He was Tony Rodriguez, the man who proved that everyone deserves a second chance. The program helped hundreds of people in its first year alone. Former fighters found new careers. Struggling martial artists got the medical care they needed. People who had lost hope discovered that their knowledge and experience still had value. Chuck and Tony never fought professionally again, but they remained training partners and close friends. Every year on the anniversary of that exhibition match, they would spar together, not to prove who was better, but to celebrate what they had built together. Years later, at Tony's 70th birthday party, his son Miguel stood up to give a toast. "My father taught me that martial arts isn't about defeating your enemies," he said. "It's about having the courage to help them become your friends." Tony looked around the room at all the people whose lives had been changed by the program. Former fighters who now had jobs and homes, instructors who had found new purpose, families that had been reunited. He thought about Chuck, who had seen a broken man in an alley and decided to help him become whole again. The martial arts world had indeed been shocked, but not just by an exhibition match between two aging fighters. They had been shocked by the realization that true strength isn't measured by how hard you can hit, but by how many people you can lift up when they've fallen down. And that, Tony knew, was the greatest victory of all.